Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Este es el mejor momento de ahorrar en Verizon, porque puedes llevarte hasta 4 teléfonos nuevos ahora en nuestros planes más bajos. Es muy fácil. Imagínate todo lo que vas a poder hacer con un teléfono nuevo. Dile chao a las fotos borrosas. Vas a poder tomarte unas selfies increíbles y vas a poder hablar con tus primos sin que se muera la batería después de 5 minutos. Este es tu momento de ahorrar. Visita tu tienda Verizon y llévate hasta 4 teléfonos 5G. Sí, 4 teléfonos, ahora en nuestros planes más bajos. Al intercambiar teléfonos de Apple, Samsung o Google en cualquier condición. Solo en Verizon.
With the Redfin app, you'll know the moment your next place hits the market. Whether you're looking to buy your dream home or rent a sweet apartment, give Redfin your gotta-have-it wish list of property features, and you'll receive real-time notifications tailored just for you. Ready to see it up close and personal? Scheduling a tour is just a tap away. Don't wait to find your perfect match. Download the Redfin app and start searching today.
Hi, I'm Christy Schreiber, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Schreiber, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. If one wanted an example of an absolutely upright man, that example would be Mandela. If one wanted an example of an unshakably firm, courageous, heroic, calm, intelligent, and capable man, that example and that man would be Mandela. I did not just reach that conclusion after having met him in person. I have thought this for many years. I identify him as one of the most extraordinary symbols of his era. Now, those were the words that were famously uttered by Fidel Castro in 1991. A man named Nelson Mandela controversially supported him in 1989. But regardless, the messenger and the majority of humanity alive at the time these remarks are even up to today, years after his death, who would disagree with Castro independent of your political persuasion. Mandela's story stands alone as a hope for redemption and grace and reconciliation, and not just for the country of South Africa, the land of his birth, or for the continent of Africa with its colonial past, but for the entire world. And the level of racial discrimination Mandela experienced is only superseded by the level of grace that he demonstrated as a leader, ready to give his life on the altar of racial reconciliation and peace. And today we explore the story of this remarkable man, and we will read the famous words of his inaugural address given on May 10th, 1994, the day a man who spent 27 years locked up as prisoner became president of South Africa, a universal symbol of social justice and hope that non-racialism and democracy can coexist on planet Earth. Today, we discuss President Nelson Mandela of South Africa and his famous inaugural address.
His name wasn't always Nelson Mandela. His given name, and I don't even know, I know for sure I can't pronounce it right, is Rolihlahla, and actually means troublemaker if you translate it from the original Xhosa language. I mean, his clan honorific from the aristocratic Thembu lineage is Madiba, and many articles about him refer to him as Madiba Mandela. But his European name, Nelson, was given to him by his primary school teacher, Miss Ningen, on his first day of school. Probably because he was named after the British Admiral Horatio Nelson, the man who famously fought in the Neapolitan Wars. But that part is a little bit unverifiable. But as we consider, these names of his in light of the life he lived, they're pretty appropriate. I mean, he was a social activist, and certainly as a social activist, he was a troublemaker in the view of his oppressors. But as president of the African National Congress and then as president of the newly democratic nation of South Africa, he certainly rose in his social status and became a hero, not unlike Horatio Nelson in history, who is also a hero. But unlike Horatio Nelson, his namesake, he was a hero for peace.
Of course, we're old enough to remember the images of him on television, but his smile and charisma as a leader was famous, and it was referred to as the Madiba magic. And many said charm radiated from him, and this enabled him to inspire people to change. And if you watch any of his speeches and interviews, it's the first thing that you notice. One notable exchange was with Ted Koppel on Town Hall in 1989, when Ted Koppel invited all sorts of people, several obvious opponents, to challenge him publicly and without prepping before the world. And Mandela not only answered every question or accusation with grace and wisdom, but also with humor. But it wasn't all charm that inspired people to change. It was the authority of his life story and the moral authority won through a prison experience that did not leave a man broken or bitter, but left him stronger and with a power to forgive and heal. And of course, fight for what Desmond Tutu termed, but Mandela reiterated in his own inaugural address, as a rainbow nation at peace with itself and with the world.
You know, and that famous story of integrating a nation starts in a tiny village in the eastern region of what today is Eastern Cape Province on July 18, 1918, when Rahulala Mandela was born. Gary, give us the short version of Mandela's world at that point in history.
Wow. I mean, this area, as well as most of the interior of South Africa, was scarred by conflicts connected to colonialism that dated well back into the 1700s. Mandela was born into a high-ranking family of the Xhosa-speaking Timbu chieftaincy. His mother was the third wife of four, but his father was high-ranking in this chief system. It was a polygamous society where birth order translated into social status in the African system. But this entire indigenous system was also held under the power of the overriding colonial white system, a system that would really only worsen and tighten its grip on the majority black population of South Africa as Mandela grew older. Mandela's mother converted to Methodism when Mandela was a child, and he was baptized and raised Methodist, which is important, as we'll see throughout Mandela's life, because even though Mandela was always a Christian and the values he advocated for his entire life were rooted in Christianity, he, for the most part, kept that part of him very private. He understood the complexities of a multi-religious society. He also understood as well as anyone, and better than most, how religion and the name of God can be really desecrated and militantly abused to ravish some of the worst human rights violations possible. He himself had been a victim of this.
Well, and it was a village school, actually, that he attended, wearing a cut-off pair of his father's pants that Mrs. Dingang famously gave him his English name, Nelson, a name much more pronounceable in English than his birth name, although at the time, Mandela didn't speak English. When he was 9 years old, Mandela's father died of a lung disease, probably tuberculosis, and his mother saw that she needed to hand her son, because he was brilliant, over to another man who actually would raise him and be kind of a surrogate father to him for the rest of his life. Mandela, because of this, had a rare opportunity, but he also never really got to see much of his mother again, which is something he always regretted. Having said that, Mandela's guardian enabled his education. I mean, he attended a coeducational Methodist secondary school, then he went on to Hilton College and Methodist senior school. You know, at that time, he was trained to be what he called a black Englishman. I mean, his life was regimented in school just like any Victorian school child. I mean, he was disciplined by bells and alarms, and he learned discipline and British efficiency, and that served him his entire life. Nelson Mandela considered himself an Anglophile for his whole life. But from there, Mandela obtained a scholarship, and he studied at the prestigious University of Fort Hare.
Let me point out that the University of Fort Hare is really an important institution. This was the unofficial training ground for Africa's future leaders. Presidents for almost all of post-colonial Africa, including Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Seretse Khama of Botswana, they all received their education at this institute. Several leaders who would ultimately spend their lives fighting for racial integration in South Africa were there during Mandela's time there, and they formed bonds that were going to last a lifetime.
Well, Mandela's time there was shortened. I mean, there's several political things that happened that we don't have time to get into all those details. He had some job changes. But eventually, Mandela ended up an English-speaking, educated man living in a township of Alexandria right outside Johannesburg, right in the thick of the Black struggle for urban survival. It was in this township that he grew in political awareness. He became acquainted and became a part of the ANC, which is what we call the African National Congress. That's the party that today rules South Africa, in which he would eventually be a leader. By that time, it was still emerging and developing as a place where Africans were finding their voice.
Well, let me point out, the ANC is an organization that ultimately becomes the leading political party in South Africa, but it was not at that time. It started small, and it was a minority party because it originally advocated for peaceful negotiations with the white population. And over the course of the struggle, which we're going to talk about specifically, even Mandela became convinced that peaceful negotiations in the vein of Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King would not work in South Africa. But eventually, it is this organization with Mandela as its leader, more than any other, that's responsible for the peaceful end of apartheid in South Africa.
Well, for young Mandela, I mean, his journey from believing in peaceful negotiations to violence, then back to peaceful negotiations, began in these townships that surrounded Johannesburg. I mean, Johannesburg, by the way, it's South Africa's largest city, but it is where he witnessed what he called 1,000 indignities.
Well, one of those indignities was the Population Registration Act of 1950, which literally made everyone be classified as white, native, meaning black, or colored, meaning mixed, and then giving privileges based on their race classification, the worst being native. And under this law, it was illegal for whites to marry non-whites. It was illegal for whites to have intercourse with non-whites. Everyone was looked at by an official of the government, and they were declared a race according to their appearance. And the definition of what constituted a white person was as unscientific as you can imagine. I mean, let me read the language of the law as it defines what it means to be white. And here's what it says. Someone who in appearance is obviously a white person, not generally accepted as a colored person, or is generally accepted as a white person. I mean, that's a quote. That's lifted straight out of the law. In many cases, a person could be classified as white or colored or native, and then the commissioner's office may change the classification. But being classified as white meant that you had privileges that to us seemed like basic rights. But in South Africa, under the system, they were only given to white people. For example, only whites could live or even rent property in the cities. Blacks had to live outside the cities in what were called townships. Whites had different salary scales for the exact same jobs as blacks. For example, a black miner could earn on average $25 a month working in the diamond mines, but a white miner who worked on the same mine doing the exact same thing would earn an average of $375 a month. Only whites could own businesses or land in town. But what blacks hated most of all was the implementation of the Pass Laws Act of 1952, which made it illegal for any black person over the age of 16 to go anywhere without a passbook. If a black person was caught without his passbook, he would be arrested. It was essential for employment and daily travel. Over the course of time, the race laws got stricter, and the quality of life for those living as blacks got harsher. Now, this is not to say that all white people endorsed the system, because they didn't. But it didn't matter. Speaking out against the system by anyone black or white was dangerous, and any dissent was swiftly handled.
Mandela, because he was one of the few who could read and write, had access to better jobs than most of his black countrymen. But that didn't mean that he was able to climb South Africa's social ladder, because that was racially impossible. He did marry a nurse by the name of Evelyn Mace, and they had 4 children together. But the level of discontentment that he was experiencing only increased with time as he saw what was going on. And because of that, his level of involvement within the ANC increased. I mean, as a person witnessing all these things, he was looking for solutions, and he studied Marxism and communism, which a lot of people thought was, and maybe they still think, is a solution for South Africa in post-colonial war. But although Mandela would eventually reject communism as his solution, he always understood why people were moving in that direction. He was sympathetic to the ideals. He became a practicing lawyer, and he worked as such to defend against many injustices in the nation's growing resistance movement to the apartheid regime, which is what they called it. Gary, it's been a long time since 1994, and even longer since the beginning of apartheid, which, like I said, that's the name of this system of government in South Africa. And the word apartheid literally means separateness. And it was the law that was codified from 1948 to 1994. We talked about that it created a system of race classification. We talked about the passbooks, but that's just the beginning.
Is 1994 really a long time ago?
I'm not saying anything about it.
Okay, well, it is 30 years ago. So from 1948 to 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president, South Africa was ruled by a system of institutionalized racism, somewhat modeled after the Jim Crow system in the American South, but much harsher even than what happened in the United States. The South African classification system eventually added a 4th category, which is Indian Asian, but everyone was classified. Your classification determined where you could live, what you could do for a living, where you could go to school, who you could marry, and the Groups Areas Act of 1950, which specified where each group could live. I mean, the areas where the blacks could live were underdeveloped, far from the city centers, overcrowded with very bad social services. They were literally shanty towns. And besides group areas, hospitals, buses, beaches, schools, everything was segregated by race. Non-whites could not vote, and they had no representation in government. Opposition to apartheid was harsh. And groups like the ANC, which you mentioned, were outlawed, and their leaders were jailed. And obviously, under this system, non-whites got all the worst jobs, the worst care, and the worst education, if any at all. It was a completely and unapologetically and openly unjust system. And as you can imagine, it sparked violence, not necessarily from the blacks, ironically, but from the white government. And every time the ANC would organize a protest, the government swiftly and immediately came down violently on the demonstrators. Eventually, the world became aware of this. The international community put a lot of pressure on South Africa. Economic sanctions and other international forces really bore down on South Africa, completely isolating them from the outside world. For example, the United Nations put sanctions on South Africa and asked all countries to stop doing business with South Africa, which eventually most did. Even the United States and the UK, which were resistant at first because they were financially invested in South Africa, they stopped banking with South Africa, stopped buying their products or invested in them. FIFA banned South Africa from the World Cup. South Africa was banned from the Olympics from 1964 to 1992, and many musicians refused to play there. They withdrew from under pressure from the British Commonwealth, and Dr. Martin Luther King openly criticized apartheid. They were, in essence, exiled from the rest of the entire world.
You know, I hate to admit this, but I lived there. Well, we were living in Zimbabwe, but I went down there and I saw this in real time, this division of everything. I can clearly remember driving down the highway and seeing the townships from the highway that were dividing the white community and the black community. And so
you had a firsthand experience.
Yeah, it really did happen. It seems like it wouldn't, like it would be an imagination that this kind of thing would exist, but it really did happen. And it was this system that Mandela was resisting, both, as a lawyer, but also as a journalist. I mean, he threw himself into this movement. Unfortunately, though, it was not a passion shared by his devoted Jehovah's Witness wife, who didn't believe in political involvement. This led to conflict, and of course, their marriage ended in divorce in 1958. Wasn't too long after his divorce, though, from her, that he famously became involved with the very colorful, headstrong, and very political Winnie Madikizela. She herself would become a world icon in her own right years later. But they married, and she would be, honestly, for all the controversy that she created in her later years, she was his biggest advocate during his prison years. They did divorce 2 years after Mandela became president, because whereas in Mandela's 27 years in prison, he had time to contemplate, and he made a choice to go down a path of forgiveness and then promote peace and reconciliation with his oppressors. Winnie's time outside of the prison, and she did suffer, no question about it. She was persecuted outside there for many, many years, and this led to her making different choices. She was fiercely committed against the anti-apartheid movement. She became increasingly militaristic, and this division led them to, among other things, divorce.
Oh, yes. Winnie was a controversy and a firebrand until the day she died, and her life was under an unrelenting microscope during Mandela's imprisonment.
True, and in those early days, they were on the same team because Mandela became involved with something called the treason trial, where basically the ANC was accused by the apartheid government of trying to overthrow the government. The case was eventually overthrown, but not before Mandela spent 5 months in prison. From that point onward, Mandela had to use pseudonyms, and he had to go undercover, and he would disappear. But all the time, he was still protesting. He was still speaking. He was still organizing. He was nicknamed the Black Pimpernel because the white government could never catch him. He gave speeches. He organized protests. I mean, he was a leader of the ANC and had a lot of weight.
One famous example of a protest was the Sharpeville Massacre, which took place on March 21st in 1960. The ANC, along with another group called the PAC, organized thousands of black Africans to gather peacefully around police stations and burn their hated passbooks. And Sharpeville is a township outside of Johannesburg, and in Sharpeville, around 7,000 gathered to participate. The South African police, without warning or provocation, just opened fire on the unarmed, unsuspecting crowd. 69 people were killed, and many of them being women and children. Many more were shot, almost all of them in the back as they tried to run away.
It's kind of impossible to imagine police just opening fire on random people.
Well, democratic countries do take outrage at those kind of things. And so it was shocking, and the world took note. And after that massacre, the South African government banned both the PAC and the ANC. And it was because of this event, as well as others like that convinced the young Nelson Mandela that nonviolence would not work in South Africa. The South African government would never relent without armed revolution, not unlike what the Americans did in the Revolutionary War. And so, with the support of the ANC, Mandela snuck out of the country to travel across Africa looking for military support for the overhaul of South Africa. And it was when he returned from this crusade to garner support across Africa that he was picked up by the police. The charge was leaving the country without a valid passport and for inciting workers to strike. Mandela, at this trial, conducted his own defense, and he was sentenced to 5 years of imprisonment. And however, less than a year later, in July 1963, while in prison on the infamous Robben Island, other incriminating documents were discovered, one of which was Mandela's diary. He was tried again. This trial is now famous. It's called the Rivonia trial. The state was calling for the death sentence, and Mandela had every reason to believe he was going to get it. It was during this trial that Mandela gave an iconic speech, which today we call the I am prepared to die speech. In his speech, he justified the actions of the ANC and expressed his commitment to democracy and freedom and equality.
Well, this speech certainly got the attention of the world, and it helped turn Mandela into a symbol of resistance. In fact, it's been noted that even while he was speaking, as he shared the realities of what they were experiencing of racial exclusivity, there was an audible sigh of agreement inside the courtroom. I mean, let me read, though, the concluding remarks, because they've been made famous over the years. And remember, when he was saying these words, he just was 100% convinced, because the government always got what it wanted, that he was getting ready to die. And this is what he said. I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Everyone knew he was right, but that did not change the outcome of the trial. He was pronounced guilty, but instead of being condemned to death, he was condemned to life in prison back on Robben's Island.
Now, Mandela's time at Robben's Island was long, and Robben's Island is notorious. Political prisoners were just given the bare minimum to eat. And oh, by the way, even their race mattered. Blacks were given less food than coloreds or Asians. Prisoners, including Mandela, were forced to do hard labor in the limestone quarry, which, not only was painful, but in Mandela's case, it caused damage to his eyes because of the bright light reflecting on the limestone. And Mandela and others like him could only get one 30-minute visit every 6 months and only 2 letters per year. I mean, this place was designed to destroy morale and really break a person's spirit. Well,
in Mandela's case, it did not. I mean, he fought to keep his soul alive. And one of the ways he did that was by studying. I mean, he also worked on the inside to improve the living conditions of the prison, and he actually succeeded in making the living conditions on Robben's Island more humane. Another thing Mandela did while he was in prison is he learned Afrikaans, which is interesting because, that's the language of one of the 2 groups of white people who live in South Africa, and really the harsher of the 2 groups, if you want to be honest about it.
Well, one misconception that many have about South Africa is that all the white people are the same and they're all of British descent, and that's not true. It's also not true that all black Africans in South Africa speak the same language. Today, South Africa recognizes 12 official languages. Zulu is the most spoken as a first language. English is the most spoken as a second language. But Afrikaans is the most spoken first language among white Africans. It's a derivative of Dutch because you have to remember that South Africa was settled by the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. And the descendants of those settlers spoke Dutch, not English. So amongst the white population, more grew up than even today speaking Afrikaans as a first language. And in the 1970s, there was another huge uprising in Soweto, which is a black area outside of Johannesburg, because the government enforced the use of Afrikaans in schools alongside English. And the black community saw Afrikaans as a language of oppression, and they didn't want to learn it.
Well, in prison, Mandela did learn it. And in his words, let me quote him. We ought to speak directly to the Afrikaner and fully explain our position. Honest men are to be found on both sides of the color line, and the Afrikaner is no exception. If this country is reduced to ashes, it will still be necessary for us to sit down together and talk about the problems of Reconstruction, the black and the white, the African and the Afrikaner.
I think that quote is an extremely important one because it highlights one of the most important ideas that Mandela developed over his years at Robben's Island, and it molded him really into the great advocate of peace that we know him as of today. And Mandela learned that dialogue can be forged between 2 polarized groups. And he also understood that if peace was ever to happen in this country, he needed Afrikaner support for the reconstruction of a unified nation. Mandela learned that negotiating with an enemy is not selling out. It's actually victory. Mandela grew as a leader within the prison, and there were a lot of political prisoners. There were a lot of warders who learned to rely on Mandela to help Robben's Island be a place of peace, and he effected change there. One warder wrote that under Mandela's leadership, rebellious inmates learned from Mandela to become more rational and easier to manage. Even in prison, Mandela was considered the leader of the ANC in South Africa. And by 1975, he was allowed 3 letters a month as well as 2 non-contact visits a month. By his 60th birthday in 1978, unbeknownst to Mandela, still locked away, there was a free Mandela movement underway based out of London. His face was becoming the face of the anti-apartheid movement. By the time of his 70th birthday, there was a rock concert held at Wembley Stadium in London and broadcast across the world for 200 million people to see. And Mandela's image of a long-suffering savior locked away for his attempts to bring a non-racial society to South Africa were everywhere, and it was a very powerful image.
By the late 1970s, Mandela was no longer called Mandela within the prison system, but he was called by his honorific clan name, Madiba. Within the prison walls, he was a teacher, but he also was a student. He read thousands of books, biographies of kind of those. Some examples would be like Winston Churchill. He read fiction like Tolstoy and Steinbeck. And of course, he read religious texts like the Bible, but he also read an English translation of the Quran. He consumed whatever he can get, which was a lot. Poetry, history, philosophy, everything. He was a scholar and leader of his people from the inside, but he was a leader of the inside and the outside of these prison walls.
And South Africa needed a unifying leader. By 1989, the amount of unrest all over South Africa was increasing. There were bombings and violence. There was potential for an out-and-out civil war. And South Africa needed a solution. Even the Afrikaner government understood that. President de Klerk knew it. The tide had turned both inside and outside Africa. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu on September 13th, 1989, was allowed to speak at a march, and in a move that was called by a white government official a more fearful leap into the dark than the release of Mandela himself. The police for 10 days previously had used a water cannon loaded with purple dye to break up a multiracial protest full of whites and coloreds and blacks. This is how Desmond Tutu ended his speech. They tried to make us one color, purple. We say we are the rainbow people. We are the new people of the new South Africa. So there were negotiations back and forth, but eventually 5 months after Bishop Tutu's speech on February 2nd, 1990, President de Klerk of South Africa made a significant speech in which it seemed in one moment he was reversing the apartheid policies of the last 30 years and was granting the release of all the ANC political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. On Sunday, February 11th, 1990, Mandela with his wife, Winnie, together walked out in front of the world. Mandela raised his famous fist in the classic ANC salute in front of the millions who had been a part of the Free Mandela campaign across the world. He was, at that moment, the world's most famous political prisoner. He was on the cover of Time magazine that week, and for a moment it was truly glorious. But the hard work of building a functioning democracy was before him, and it wasn't enough just to make peace with his former oppressors. As if that wasn't hard enough, he had to consolidate support within his own people. Many, including his wife, were more radical than he was. There were too many factions, too many opinions, so much bitterness, so much treachery, and death at the hands of the South African government. How could a free and fair election ever occur in South Africa? And if the government were overtaken by blacks, would they execute a bloodbath on their former oppressors?
Those are all good questions, and history has shown there was a mixed bag on that. But at the time, Mandela and de Klerk, which is amazing when you consider, Klerk had been responsible for, this man lost 27 years of his life, but they worked together and they made it happen. The date was set. 1994 would mark the year of the first democratic election ever to be held in the country of South Africa. And as a nod and in recognition of this miraculous feat, Both Mandela and de Klerk were jointly awarded the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize.
And Election Day all over South Africa was peaceful. There were long lines all over the country as black and white men and women lined up to vote for the very first time. The ANC won in a landslide, and on May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first democratic president. He was 76 years old. At the time of the inauguration, Mandela was sworn in as president. He delivered his inaugural address, and then everyone on stage and in the crowd sang both the Afrikaner national anthem and the ANC freedom hymn. Mandela believed in honoring the past while moving toward a unified future, and singing both songs was really a symbol of his commitment to the reconciliation.
You know, this speech, it's not very long, and in some ways it's structured not too differently from JFK's inaugural address, but he speaks directly to his compatriots. He acknowledges the atrocities of the past, but he puts forward a vision for the future. Let's read the speech given on May 10th, 1994.
Today, all of us who do, by our presence here and by our celebrations in other parts of our country and the world, confer glory and hope to newborn liberty out of the experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long. Must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud. Our daily deeds as ordinary South Africans must produce an actual South African reality that will reinforce humanity's belief in justice, strengthen its confidence in the nobility of the human soul, and sustain all our hopes for a glorious life for all. All this we owe both to ourselves and to the peoples of the world who are so well represented here today. To my compatriots, I have no hesitation in saying that each one of us is as intimately attached to the soil of this beautiful country as are the famous jacaranda trees of Pretoria and the mimosa trees of the Bushveld. Each time one of us touches the soil of this land, we feel a sense of personal renewal. The national mood changes as the seasons change. We are moved by a sense of joy and exhilaration when the grass turns green and the flowers bloom. That spiritual and physical oneness we all share with this common homeland explains the depth of the pain we all carried in our hearts as we saw our country tear itself apart in a terrible conflict, and as we saw it spurned, outlawed, and isolated by the peoples of the world precisely because it has become the universal base of the pernicious ideology and the practice of racism and racial oppression.
You know, he starts by speaking of the beautiful land, the shared space of South African soil. He also challenges all South Africans to look at themselves, not as only sharing a physical space, but a spiritual oneness as one people. I want to point out that he invokes what is best in humanity, the human soul, and sets themselves apart as being potentially an example of what redeems humans. Let's keep going.
We, the people of South Africa, feel fulfilled that humanity has taken us back into its bosom, that we who were outlaws not so long ago have today been given the rare privilege to be host to the nations of the world on our own soil. We thank all of our distinguished international guests for having come to take possession with the people of our country of what is, after all, a common victory for justice, for peace, for human dignity. We trust that you will continue to stand by us as we tackle the challenges of building peace, prosperity, non-sexism, non-racialism, and democracy. We deeply appreciate the role that the masses of our people and their political mass democratic, religious, women, youth, business, traditional, and other leaders have played to bring about this conclusion. Not least among them is my second deputy president, the Honorable F.W. de Klerk. We would also like to pay tribute to our security forces in all their ranks for the distinguished role they have played in securing our first democratic elections and a transition to democracy from bloodthirsty forces which still refuse to see the light. The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us.
And of course, he thanks those who worked to dismantle apartheid, but he challenges his countrymen to be open to healing. I mean, Mandela, and the reason why people were willing to listen to him, because more than anyone, he understands that freedom to vote is just the first step. So much of South Africa did not and still not have basic services like running water, electricity, healthcare, schools. I mean, getting free is not a one-day thing. Let's keep going.
We have, at last, achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discriminations. We succeeded to take our last steps to freedom in conditions of relative peace. We commit ourselves to the construction of a complete, just, and lasting peace. We have triumphed in the effort to implant hope in the breasts of the millions of our people. We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable right to human dignity, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and with the world.
And of course, that's the line that he borrowed from Archbishop Desmond Tutu and has been made famous ever since. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. And that was the dream.
As a token of its commitment to the renewal of our country, the new interim government of national unity will, as a matter of urgency, address the issue of amnesty for various categories of our people who are currently serving terms of imprisonment. We dedicate this day to all the heroes and heroines in this country and the rest of the world who sacrificed in many ways and surrendered their lives so that we could be free. Their dreams have become reality. Freedom is their reward. We are both humbled and elevated by the honor and privilege that you, the people of South Africa, have bestowed upon us. As the first president of a united, democratic, non-racial, and non-sexist South Africa, we lead our country out of the valley of darkness. We understand it still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for building nations, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Let each know that for each, the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. God bless Africa.
And of course, that ending is so powerful because it's very emotional. Let there be justice. Let there be peace. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt. And of course, never, never, never again should that land experience the oppression. And he uses that image of being the skunk of the world. And he ends by saying, let freedom reign. Let freedom reign. And the image of the sun. It's a beautiful image, a symbol of light, a symbol of warmth, a symbol of beauty. And he says, God bless Africa.
Mandela was only a one-term president. He was already 75 when he took office, and although many wanted him to stay, he, like George Washington, wanted to establish a precedent of passing leadership forward in democratic fashion. And he saw it as his role to help South Africa take its first steps towards racial reconciliation. And he established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was designed to uncover the atrocities that were committed during apartheid, provide reparations, and even amnesty when confessions of atrocities were honestly confessed. Victims needed closure. And although it was not perfect, it was a vision of forgiveness.
That's kind of what we think about when we think about Nelson Mandela. He was a visionary. He saw a future, and that's his legacy. We must not consider South Africa just in light of its struggles the struggles of apartheid, and we don't want to think of it only as the struggles that it experiences today, because they're still significant. But we want to think of it as this image and this vision of racial harmony that Mandela saw. It's powerful, and he leaves that behind. He demonstrates that there is incredible power of forgiveness. It gives one an ability to heal, and even a nation can be healed.
You know, we never see images of Mandela suffering or in rage. And, you know, most images of Mandela are images of his beautiful smile. And Mandela is an icon of freedom who is distinctly different from other figures from that era in that he actually lived. He was not murdered like Che Guevara, or martyred like Martin Luther King, or assassinated like JFK. Mandela lived until the age of 95 and worked tirelessly to the end.
I also want to point out, unlike many leaders of that era and like many leaders today, Nelson Mandela never fell victim. He was never trapped by corruption. He didn't harbor millions of dollars in secret accounts. I mean, he lived until the day he died simply, modestly, and he lived in peace. At age 80, he married for the third time, that was the last time, to Graça Machel. She was the widow of the president of Mozambique. And they lived together in harmony, and he died in 2013. And at that time, really, he was more of a myth by that point than a man. But he leaves us with the hope that redemption, although seemingly impossible, is indeed possible.
Well, thank you for listening. We hoped you enjoyed this discussion of President Mandela and his inaugural address as President of South Africa. Remember, you can always find us at howtolovelitpodcast.com. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere. We hope you will support the podcast by sharing this episode or episode with a friend or classmate. And remember, it's when you share that we grow. Thank you for sharing and helping us make reading and understanding great literature accessible to as many people as possible.
Peace out.
Hey, this is Naomi Ekperigan, co-host of the podcast Couples Therapy. I wanted to talk to you about Boost Mobile, the newest 5G network in the country. Boost Mobile's new network delivers customers the speed and service they'd expect from the big three, plus groundbreaking benefits you'd only get from a true challenger in the industry, like letting people try the network risk-free for 30 days, and offering a $25 per month unlimited plan that's guaranteed to never go up in price. So visit your nearest Boost Mobile store or find them online at boostmobile.com.
Applebee's has a brand new Big Easy menu. It features all your Bourbon Street favorites in one new menu. Plus a new Bourbon Street chicken and andouille sausage penne starting at just $11.99. With Cajun flavors sure to get your taste buds dancing. Applebee's is bringing Bourbon Street to your street. Make sure to try the Big Easy menu now, only at Applebee's. Only at Applebee's.
Limited time, price, participation, and selection may vary.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.